Close your eyes now, if they are not already closed. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Slowly, gently, the way snow settles onto a quiet field in the hours before dawn. Let your hands grow heavy at your sides and feel the weight of your body sinking, softly, into the surface beneath you. There is nothing you need to do tonight. There is nowhere you need to be. There is only this voice, low and unhurried, and the long, slow river of history that stretches back through the centuries, back through the years, back through the candlelit rooms and dusty herbalists' gardens, and sun-bleached desert plains, where a particular plant has grown quietly in the margins of human civilization for thousands of years. Tonight, we are going to drift together into that history, you and I, and we are going to follow this plant through time, through culture, through medicine and myth, through the slow turning of centuries, through all the places where human beings looked upon a simple flower and saw something holy, something terrible, something unknowable at the edges of the world they understood. And you will not need to remember any of it. You can let each sentence fall through your mind like a stone through dark water, drifting down and away, until there is only the soft current of words and the deepening quiet of sleep. If this voice helps you rest tonight, consider subscribing to Plague Lullaby, but only if you are still awake, only if these words have not yet carried you where they are meant to carry you. The plant we are considering tonight belongs to the genus Datura, a name that arrives in the English language, trailing centuries of older names behind it. Datura in Sanskrit, Jewsmathel in the Arabic of medieval physicians, thorn apple in the herbalist's manuals of 16th century Europe, Jimson weed in the American colonies, Yerba del Diablo in the Spanish of the borderlands, which translates softly and without drama as the herb of the devil. It is a member of the Solanaceae family, that ancient and quietly extraordinary clan of flowering plants that also includes the tomato, the potato, the pepper, and the tobacco plant, all of them sharing a kind of botanical kinship that stretches back through millions of years of evolutionary time. The datura plant itself is not a remarkable thing to look at in the way that remarkable things are usually understood. It is not enormous. It is not jewel bright. It is not adorned with the kind of extravagant beauty that draws the eye from across a field. It grows in disturbed soil, along roadsides, at the edges of gardens and waste places, in the dry margins where other plants have given up, and it sends up its branching stems to a modest height of perhaps 3 or 4 feet, bearing dark green leaves with irregular, slightly jagged edges, and producing, in the evenings of summer, large trumpet-shaped flowers of white or pale violet that open as the sun descends and close again before midday, as if the plant is keeping its most beautiful face turned toward the dark. The flowers are followed by spiny, rounded seed pods, armored with soft thorns, which is where one of its names, thorn apple, originates, and these pods crack open in the autumn to release their dark, kidney-shaped seeds into whatever wind or passing creature will carry them onward. It is a plant that has spread itself across nearly every temperate and warm region of the world, through a combination of its own quiet persistence and the inadvertent assistance of human beings who, over the course of centuries, have carried it with them in seed packets and herbalists' bundles, and the unexamined soil clinging to their boots. What makes Datura extraordinary, what places it at the center of so many centuries of human history, is not its appearance, but its chemistry, which is to say, what the plant carries inside itself, dissolved in the fluids of every leaf and seed and root and flower. The Datura plant produces a family of compounds known as tropane alkaloids. and the three most significant of these are atropine, scopolamine, and hyoscyamine, each of them capable of interfering with the way the human nervous system transmits its signals. Each of them able, in sufficient quantity, to dissolve the boundary between what is real and what is not. These alkaloids are the plant's own form of defense, a chemical language evolved over millions of years to discourage the animals and insects that might otherwise consume it, and they are present in every part of the plant. In the roots, most concentrated of all, in the leaves and stems, in the flowers, in the seeds, and even in the pollen. A person who consumes even a small quantity of datura material enters a state that is described in the medical literature with clinical restraint as anticholinergic toxidrome, which means that the compounds have blocked the action of acetylcholine, one of the nervous system's primary messenger molecules. And this blockade produces effects that ripple outward through nearly every system of the body in ways that physicians through the centuries have struggled to describe with adequate precision. The heart rate rises. The pupils dilate so wide that the eyes appear to darken, as if the iris has been consumed by the pupil. The mouth grows dry, the skin dry and warm. The urge to urinate is suppressed, and the person affected becomes increasingly confused, increasingly unable to distinguish the ordinary world from the elaborate, often deeply convincing visions that the alkaloids produce in the mind. What makes datura different from many other plants with hallucinogenic properties is that the visions it produces are not recognized as visions by the person experiencing them. They are experienced as ordinary reality, as fully three-dimensional, fully sensory encounters with people and creatures and landscapes that have no existence outside the altered state of the brain. It is not, as historians and pharmacologists have noted, a psychedelic experience in the way that word is usually understood. It is a delirium, and the person who undergoes it typically has no memory of it afterward, waking from it hours or days later into a confusion so profound that the ordinary world seems strange. And it was this quality, the absolute reality of the visions, the complete loss of the ordinary self, the encounter with something that seemed to come from beyond the known world, that made datura, across so many cultures and so many centuries, a plant of sacred and terrifying significance. Archaeologists working in the American Southwest have found evidence that datura was in use among the indigenous peoples of that region for at least 3,000 years, and perhaps considerably longer, based on the presence of datura seeds and seed pod fragments in excavated sites, and the appearance of what are believed to be representations of the plant's distinctive form in the rock art and painted pottery of several ancient cultures. The Salado people, who flourished in the region now known as Arizona and New Mexico, between roughly the 13th and 15th centuries, produced ceramic vessels whose painted decorations include what researchers believe to be the spiny seed pod of the datura plant, suggesting that the plant held enough cultural significance to be worth commemorating in the decorated objects of everyday and ceremonial life. Among the peoples who came after, and among those who were already present when the Salado were creating their pottery, datura occupied a central and carefully managed place in the ceremonial and healing traditions of many communities. The Chumash people of the California coast prepared a drink from datura roots, which they called momoy, after the personified old woman spirit they associated with the plant, and in Chumash oral tradition it is recorded that boys of approximately 8 years of age were given a carefully prepared and carefully dosed preparation of momoy as part of the rites of passage that marked their entry into adulthood, the intention being to place the young person in contact with spiritual beings who would serve as guides and protectors through the years of life ahead. Chumash shamans used datura to enter the trance state from which they performed their healing work, diagnosing illnesses and consulting with the spiritual world. And the preparation and administration of the plant was managed with great care and considerable expertise, because the Chumash healers understood, through long generations of accumulated knowledge, that the difference between a dose that opened the mind to vision and a dose that caused irreparable harm was not a wide margin, and that the plant required respect. The Zuni people of what is now New Mexico used powdered datura root in the ceremonies associated with rain and agricultural fertility, and rain priests incorporated the plant into their ritual practices in ways that combined what we might today separate into the categories of pharmacology and prayer, understanding these things not as distinct domains, but as aspects of the same conversation between human beings and the living world they inhabited. Further south and further back in recorded time, datura was known to the civilisations of ancient India under the Sanskrit name datura, and it appears in texts of considerable antiquity in the context of its association with Shiva, the great deity of the Hindu tradition, who presides over creation and dissolution, over time itself, over the transformations between one state of being and another. Between the 11th and 12th centuries of the Common Era, according to historical records, datura was formerly associated with the worship of Shiva, and the plant's power to dissolve ordinary consciousness, to unmake the sense of a fixed and bounded self, was understood as consonant with the god's own nature, which is to say the nature of transformation and transcendence. The Buddhist tantric scripture, known as the Guhyasamaja Tantra, composed approximately in the 8th century of the Common Era, includes instructions for the ritual use of datura as part of the Vajrayana tradition of esoteric Buddhist practice, and scholars of this literature have noted that the plant's capacity to produce states of profound disorientation and unusual perception was understood within this tradition as a potential pathway to altered forms of awareness, though as scholars also emphasize, the ritual contexts in which these practices occurred were surrounded by careful structures of initiation and guidance. The great Arabian physician Ibn Sina, known in the European tradition as Avicenna, described a plant he called Jewsmathel in the 11th century, which scholars have identified as Datura metel, and his account, which appeared in his monumental Canon of Medicine, noted the plant's capacity to produce sleep, to relieve pain, and to cause confusion in the mind of those who consumed it, placing it in the long tradition of medical observation that stretches from the ancient world through the medieval period into the modern. Theophrastus, the Greek philosopher and student of Aristotle, had written about the hallucinogenic properties of what historians believe was datura, stramonium, as early as approximately 301 years before the Common Era, and his account contains what is considered one of the earliest references in Western literature to the concept of tolerance, the phenomenon by which repeated exposure to a substance changes the body's response to it, a concept that would not receive its formal scientific articulation for another 2 millennia. The Greek physician Pedanius Dioscorides, whose De Materia Medica, composed in the 1st century of the Common Era, somewhere between the years 40 and 70, became one of the foundational texts of Western medicine, and remained in active use by physicians and apothecaries for more than 1,500 years, included an account of the thorn apple among his descriptions of medicinal plants, noting its intoxicating properties and its capacity to produce visions, and recommending it in carefully managed doses for the treatment of pain. The De Materia Medica was copied and recopied through the monasteries and libraries of the Byzantine Empire, and then of medieval Europe, and Dioscores's account of Datura travelled with it, passing through the hands of Arab scholars who translated it into Arabic in the 9th century during the great flowering of Islamic learning in Baghdad and other centres of knowledge, and then back into Latin through the translation movements of the 12th century in cities like Toledo and Palermo, where Arabic manuscripts were being rendered into the language of European scholarship. Through all of these centuries of copying and translation, the thorn apple remained a plant about which something was known. Its appearance, its uses, its dangers, even as the understanding of precisely why it did what it did to the human body, remained entirely beyond the reach of the medicine of any era before the 19th century. It is worth pausing for a moment here, in the soft quiet of this late hour, to consider what it meant to live with a knowledge that was incomplete in ways you could not yet articulate. To know that a plant could transform a person's experience of reality without having any means of understanding the molecular conversation happening between the plant's compounds and the tissues of the human nervous system, and to build around that incomplete knowledge a whole architecture of ceremony and caution and accumulated practical wisdom that served, imperfectly but meaningfully, to manage a power that would not be chemically understood for many centuries, still to come. The history of Datura is, in this way, a history of human beings trying to find the edges of what they knew and to act wisely within those edges, and sometimes failing and sometimes succeeding, and always, in one form or another, being changed by the encounter with the plant that makes you see the devil. Meanwhile, in the medieval landscape of Europe, a related family of plants was acquiring a reputation that would shape centuries of history in ways that extended far beyond the realm of medicine or botany. The Solanaceae family, of which Datura is a member, includes several other European species, most notably Atropa belladonna, the deadly nightshade, and Hyoscyamus niger, the henbane. And all of them produce the same tropane alkaloids, the same atropine and scopolamine and hyoscyamine, the same capacity to blur the line between ordinary experience and something else entirely. Belladonna, whose name translates from the Italian as beautiful woman, acquired that particular name through a practice that the historical record places in the Italy of the Renaissance period, when women are said to have prepared dilute extracts of the plant's berries and used them as eye drops because the alkaloids within them caused the pupil of the eye to dilate, and large, dark, dilated pupils were considered in that era a mark of beauty and desirability, a sign of responsiveness, of openness, of a kind of liquid expressiveness that painters of the period prized in their subjects. The practice is mentioned in the herbalist literature of the period, and the name that resulted from it, belladonna, beautiful woman, is one of those strange artifacts of history in which a cosmetic fashion from a specific time and place becomes permanently attached to a plant and travels with it through the centuries, arriving in the pharmacopoeias of the modern era as a reminder of the Renaissance women who used it to make their eyes appear larger. But belladonna and henbane and datura were not primarily cosmetic plants in medieval Europe. They were primarily plants of medicine. And in the cultural imagination of the period, plants of something darker and more ambiguous, plants that occupied the boundary between the physician's dispensary and the witch's cauldron, between the healing arts and the arts of those who were suspected of communing with forces beyond the Christian world's understanding of the natural order. the literature of the witch trials that swept through Europe between approximately the 14th and 17th centuries, and that reached their terrible peak in the 16th and 17th centuries, in regions including Germany, France, Scotland, and the English colonies in America, contains many references to ointments and preparations whose ingredients, when examined by modern historians with pharmacological training, appear to be consistent with the tropane alkaloid containing plants of the Solanaceae family. A document from the 15th century describes a Dominican priest who observed a woman anoint her body with a green ointment and fall into what appeared to be a deep trance. And when the woman woke, she reported that she had been transported to a gathering of witches, a sabbat, where she had danced and feasted and communed with figures of dark power, and that she had experienced all of it with complete conviction, with no sense that she was dreaming or hallucinating, but that she had genuinely been somewhere other than the room in which her body had remained throughout the night. The physician Andreas de Laguna, who served as doctor to Pope Julius III in the 16th century, and was therefore a man of considerable medical standing, reportedly analysed a tube of ointment taken from the possession of a woman accused of witchcraft, and described it as green in colour and containing hemlock, solanum, mandragora, and henbane, all of them plants capable of producing through transdermal absorption. That is, through the skin, the disorienting, vision-producing effects of the tropane alkaloids. Effects which, when interpreted through the religious and cultural lens of the medieval and early modern period, were understood as the evidence of genuine supernatural transportation. The witch's ointment, as it is known in the historical literature, is one of those remarkable examples of a pharmacological phenomenon. The absorption of potent psychoactive compounds through the skin, being experienced and interpreted entirely within the framework of a different kind of understanding, a framework in which the sensations of flying, of attending strange gatherings, of encountering beings of supernatural power were understood not as the effects of alkaloids on the nervous system, but as evidence of a genuine relationship between certain human beings and the forces of darkness that the Christian world believed to be arrayed against it. The women and men accused of witchcraft in these centuries suffered terribly for these encounters, and the history of Datura and its relatives is tangled in this period with that suffering in ways that are deeply sorrowful to contemplate across the distance of the centuries. Over the next several centuries, as the witch trial period gradually gave way to what historians of science call the early modern period, and then to the Enlightenment, the tropane alkaloid plants moved slowly from the realm of dark association into the realm of systematic botanical and pharmacological investigation, though the process was long and uneven, and the older associations never disappeared entirely from the cultural imagination. Carl Linnaeus, the Swedish botanist whose systematic approach to the classification of plants and animals transformed the biological sciences in the 18th century, gave Atropa belladonna its formal scientific name in 1753, choosing the name Atropa as a reference to Atropos, the eldest of the three fates in Greek mythology, the one whose role it was to cut the thread of life. A choice that reflects both the plant's lethal potential and the continued weight of classical learning in European scientific culture. The genus name itself embedded into the taxonomy of science, a reminder that this plant had, from the earliest periods of recorded Greek thought, been understood as carrying the potential for death, and the formal name has travelled unchanged through all the subsequent reorganizations of botanical classification arriving in the 21st century as one of those places in the Latin binomial system where mythology and pharmacology intersect in a way that feels, even now, entirely appropriate. Meanwhile, Datura was spreading its range across the world through processes both deliberate and accidental, carried by travelers and traders and explorers along the routes of the great age of European expansion, naturalizing in the soil of regions that would later develop their own complex cultural relationships with the plant, among them the American colonies, where an episode in the year 1676 would give the plant one of its most enduring English names and mark one of the most well-documented mass encounters between the European colonial world and the ancient chemistry of the Solanaceae family. The year 1676 was a year of considerable political turbulence in the English colony of Virginia, where a conflict known to history as Bacon's Rebellion was working its way toward a violent resolution, and it was in the context of this political disorder that a group of soldiers stationed near the settlement of Jamestown gathered and prepared a salad from the plants they found growing in the vicinity of their camp. Among them the leaves of what we now know as Datura stramonium. The soldiers who consumed this salad entered, in the hours that followed, a state of profound and extended disorientation that rendered them entirely incapable of their military duties, for a period that the contemporary account describes as 11 days, during which they behaved in ways that their observers recorded with a mixture of bewilderment and documentary precision, sitting naked in corners, blowing feathers into the air, making faces at passers-by, smiling with a vacant contentment that had nothing to do with any intelligible experience of the world around them. The episode was recorded by Robert Beverley in his History and Present State of Virginia, published in 1705, and it is from this account that the plant acquired the name by which it is most commonly known in the United States. Jamestown weed, which over the subsequent decades was worn down by common use into Jimson weed, a name that carries within it, if you listen for it, the echo of that colonial settlement and that bewildered group of soldiers sitting in the Virginia summer, lost in a world that had nothing to do with the one the rest of the colony was inhabiting. It is a small, almost gentle story in the long history of this plant, a story without death or deliberate harm, and yet it has the quality of a parable about the nature of the plant itself, its ability to arrive in the ordinary course of life, to be mistaken for something unremarkable, and then to carry those who encounter it entirely beyond the borders of the ordinary world, into a place where the ordinary rules of time and causation and the reliable solidity of objects have been quietly suspended, and where the self, as the self is usually understood, has temporarily gone somewhere else entirely. It is a warm evening in the chemistry of the early 19th century, and in the laboratories of Europe, a series of patient and methodical experiments are slowly beginning to answer the question that physicians and herbalists and witch trial examiners had been circling around for centuries without ever quite reaching its center, which is the question of what, precisely, these plants contain and how that content produces the effects that have been observed and recorded and feared and revered across so many centuries and so many cultures. The isolation of atropine, the principal alkaloid of Atropa belladonna, was accomplished in 1831 by a German pharmacist named K. Mein, who achieved for the first time the separation of the compound in a pure form from the complex mixture of substances that make up the plant's chemistry, and this achievement was followed in 1833 by the work of the German chemists Philipp Lorenz Geiger and Hermann Hesse, who published their findings on the preparation and further characterization of atropine in the Annalen der Pharmacie, one of the leading chemical journals of the period. Scopolamine, the alkaloid most specifically associated with the dreamlike, amnesiac, visionary qualities of the Solanaceae plants, was isolated somewhat later, in 1881, by the German chemist Albert Ladenburg, who also worked out the chemical process by which related compounds could be synthesized, and whose work opened up possibility of understanding the tropane alkaloids not merely as mysteries extracted from plants, but as structures with specific shapes and properties that could be studied, modified, and eventually put to use in controlled medical contexts. The isolation of these compounds did not immediately transform medical practice. The process by which laboratory chemistry is translated into clinical application is always slower than the pace of discovery, always mediated by the accumulated caution of physicians and the gradual building of evidence and understanding, but it did begin to shift the way educated Europeans thought about the plants that produced them, moving them further from the realm of witchcraft and superstition and closer to the realm of substances that could be understood, measured, and in principle controlled. Hyoscyamin, the third of the major alkaloids, was isolated in 1833 as well, by Geiger working again with his colleagues, and the close timing of these discoveries reflects the general intellectual ferment of European chemical science in the first half of the 19th century, when the tools of analysis were becoming precise enough to begin separating the complex chemical worlds of plants into their individual components for the first time. It is worth noting, as you rest here in the quiet of this late hour, that the men who accomplished these isolations were working in small laboratories with equipment that would seem primitive by modern standards, using glassware and chemical reagents, and the accumulated procedures of a young science, motivated by the same curiosity that had sent Theophrastus to write about the effects of the thorn apple 2,000 years before them, the same desire to understand what this plant was doing to the human beings who encountered it, and why and how, and whether that understanding could be turned towards some purpose that might relieve suffering rather than cause it. The medical uses of the tropane alkaloids, once they began to be understood in their purified forms, developed through the 19th century along several distinct lines, each of them rooted in the same fundamental pharmacology, but applied to different conditions and different aspects of the relationship between the nervous system and the body it governs. Atropine's ability to block the effects of acetylcholine made it useful for treating conditions involving excessive smooth muscle contraction, and it was applied in the 19th and early 20th centuries to a wide range of conditions, including what was then called spasmodic asthma, intestinal colic, and certain forms of urinary dysfunction. And it was also used in very dilute preparations as a treatment for certain cardiac arrhythmias, because the vagus nerve, which helps regulate the heart's rhythm, is itself a cholinergic system and can be modulated by anticholinergic compounds. Scopolamine's particular profile of effects, its tendency to produce sedation and amnesia along with its anticholinergic actions, made it useful in a different set of contexts, and by the early 20th century, it had been introduced into obstetric practice in a combination with morphine that was known as twilight sleep, a form of semi-anesthesia that was promoted in Europe and subsequently in the United States as a means of managing the pain of childbirth, leaving the laboring woman in a state that was not fully unconscious, but was characterized by a deep sedation and an inability to form memories of what she was experiencing. The twilight sleep movement generated considerable public debate and controversy, touching as it did on questions about women's experience of childbirth, about the appropriate role of medical intervention in a natural process, about the relationship between pain and memory, and the political dimensions of who was entitled to determine how women experienced their own bodies. And it represents one of those moments in the history of medicine where the pharmacological properties of a plant-derived compound became entangled with the social history of gender and medical authority in ways that would take decades to fully disentangle. During this same period, Datura stramonium itself was being used in a more direct form as an asthma remedy. Preparations of dried Datura leaves were sold as smokable products burned in small metal vessels, and the resulting smoke inhaled through a mouthpiece. And these products, which had names like Asthmador and Potter's Asthma Cure, were available without prescription in the United States and England. Well into the 20th century, their active ingredient, the same bronchodilating atropine, and related compounds that had been known in various forms since the days of the ancient Indian Ayurvedic physicians who had observed the plant's effects on the respiratory system. It is one of the quiet ironies of pharmaceutical history that a plant so deeply associated with dark visions and supernatural encounter should have spent the better part of the 19th and early 20th centuries sitting on the shelves of ordinary pharmacies, packaged in small tins, purchased by the respectable and the suffering, burned in sitting rooms and bedrooms by people who needed nothing more than the relief of a clear breath. Across the Atlantic in the 19th century, as European chemists were isolating alkaloids in their laboratories, and physicians were debating the clinical uses of scopolamine, the Datura plant was continuing its long relationship with the indigenous peoples of the Americas, a relationship that was simultaneously being disrupted by the same forces of European colonial expansion that had carried the plant around the world in the previous centuries. The Chumash people of California, whose use of momoi for healing and ceremonial purposes had continued for many generations, found themselves by the mid-19th century in a situation of profound cultural disruption, following the establishment of Spanish missions along the California coast, beginning in the late 18th century, and the subsequent arrival of American settlers, following the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848, and the California Gold Rush of 1849. All of these events combining to produce a catastrophic reduction in the Chumash population and a severe disruption of the ceremonial and knowledge transmission systems within which the careful use of Datura had been embedded. The Zuni people of New Mexico similarly experienced the pressures of a colonial system that alternately forbade, discouraged, and attempted to replace traditional ceremonial practices, including those involving Datura, and while these practices did not disappear, the human desire for connection with the sacred being more persistent than any particular political or religious prohibition, they were practiced in a context of much greater constraint and much greater risk than had characterized the carefully structured ceremonial systems of earlier centuries. It is worth noting, as we drift through this part of the history, that the disruption of the knowledge systems that governed the safe use of Datura was itself a form of harm, because those knowledge systems, the accumulated practical wisdom about preparation, dosage, context, and supervision, were precisely what had made it possible for communities to engage with an extraordinarily potent and dangerous plant without the catastrophic outcomes that would later characterize encounters with the same plant in context stripped of all that accumulated understanding. The history of Datura in the 19th centuries is, in this particular thread of it, a history about the relationship between knowledge and safety, about what is lost when the structures within which dangerous knowledge is held and transmitted are damaged, and about the ways in which colonial disruption produced harms that extended far beyond the immediate political and economic dimensions of colonialism into the deeper realms of epistemology and pharmacology. Meanwhile, over the same decades, Datura was making its way into the consciousness of European and American literary and artistic culture in ways that reflected the broader fascination with the exotic and the supernatural that characterized the Romantic movement and its aftermath. Georgia O'Keeffe, the American modernist painter who spent much of her working life in the New Mexico desert, made the Datura flower, large, white, trumpet-shaped, opening in the evenings among the dusty rocks and dry grasses of the Southwest. A recurring subject in her paintings, rendering the flower's pale interior with the large-scale, intimately observed abstraction that was her signature approach, and her Datura paintings have been interpreted by art historians as expressions of both the plant's genuine visual beauty and something of its cultural resonance in the landscape where she lived and worked. The plant appears in the writings of travelers and naturalists who encountered it in the America, Southwest, and Mexico, and it surfaces in the literature of the Romantic and post-Romantic periods in Europe, in contexts that consistently invoke its association with the margins between states, between sleep and waking, between the ordinary world and the extraordinary one, between this life and whatever may lie beyond it. It is a plant that seems to call forth a certain kind of writing, a certain kind of attention, slow, careful, circling, aware of danger but unwilling to look away, drawn by something that is difficult to articulate, but that has to do with the plant's fundamental character as a living thing that sits at the boundary of the knowable and opens its flowers to the dark. The question of exactly how Datura produces its characteristic effects, the fully realized hallucinations, the deep confusion of identity and temporal orientation, the strange and often deeply personal visions that seem to emerge from the most private depths of the mind, rather than the shared material world, remained a matter of description, rather than explanation, through most of the 19th century, and well into the 20th, even as the chemistry of the alkaloids themselves was being progressively clarified. The reason for this gap between chemical understanding and mechanistic understanding is that the action of atropine and scopolamine at the level of the neuron, the specific receptors they bind to, the specific signaling pathways they interrupt, the specific consequences of that interruption for the coordinated activity of the billions of neurons that together produce what we experience as consciousness and perception could not be understood until the neuroscience of the 20th century had developed the tools and the conceptual frameworks necessary to examine the brain at this level of resolution. What was understood through careful clinical observation, beginning in the 18th century and extending through the 19th, was the syndrome that resulted from exposure to the plants, the dry skin, the racing heart, the dilated pupils, the retention of urine, the elevation of body temperature, the confusion, the hallucinations, the amnesia. And this syndrome was observed often enough in accidental and deliberate poisonings of sufficient variety that its outlines were reasonably well established by the time the first serious Toxicological textbooks of the 19th century were being written. The clinical description of anticholinergic toxidrome, as it came to be known, was built from case reports and clinical observations accumulated over decades, from the notebooks of physicians who had treated patients who had eaten the wrong plant or taken the wrong dose, and from the reports of experiments conducted on animals and, in the manner of the period, on human subjects, including the physicians themselves. The history of self-experimentation in the context of the Solanaceae plants is its own thread within the larger history, a thread that winds from the deliberate self-dosing of early pharmacologists through the more casual experiments of later periods. And it is a thread that consistently returns to the same observation, that the experience of datura is unlike the experience of other psychoactive substances in ways that make it exceptionally difficult to study from the inside. Because the inside disappears, because the person who took the dose does not reliably remain present to observe and report what is happening to them, because the observer and the observed dissolve into the same confusion. And what remains is only the bewildering aftermath, the slow return of the self to the body that has been somewhere else. The year 1676 and its Jimson weed soldiers, the medieval witch, ointment analysed by Andreas de Laguna, the Chumash boy drinking his Momoy preparation by firelight, the Renaissance woman tilting her head back and receiving a drop of belladonna extract into each eye. All of these moments exist at different points, along the same long thread. And that thread is the history of human beings, encountering a chemistry they did not fully understand, being changed by it in ways they could not entirely predict, and finding, in the encounter, something that seemed to touch upon the most fundamental questions of human experience. What is real and what is not? What lies at the edges of ordinary perception? What the mind is capable of when the chemical conditions of its ordinary functioning are altered? These questions are among the oldest questions human beings ask. And the datura plant, in its quiet, roadside, trumpet-flowered way, has been offering them a particularly vivid and disorienting form of these questions for as long as human beings. And this plant have existed in proximity to one another, which is to say for as long as we can trace the record back through time. Over the next portion of our journey tonight, we will move deeper into the stories that this history contains, into the age of colonial expansion and the way the plant travelled with it, into the strange episodes of mass poisoning that punctuate its history, into the Caribbean traditions of zombie making, in which datura played a documented and deeply significant role, and into the modern laboratory where the alkaloids of this ancient plant have been transformed with great care and patient science into medications that serve purposes of healing that would have seemed miraculous to the physicians of any previous century, sitting in their candlelit offices with their copies of Dioscorides, listening to the soft scratch of their quills against the page as they tried to write down, in language adequate to the task, what this plant was and what it did and why it mattered. There is a country in the Caribbean, small and mountainous and ancient in its sorrows, where the datura plant grows along the roadsides and at the edges of cultivated fields, under a name that carries within it a very specific understanding of what the plant can do to a human being. In Haiti, Datura stramonium is known in the Creole language as concombre zombie, which means, with a directness that leaves little room for interpretation, the zombie's cucumber. And this name is not metaphorical, not a piece of poetic hyperbole borrowed from folklore. It is a name that reflects a documented and deeply serious role that this plant has played in the social and spiritual life of Haitian Vodou society for centuries. a role that involves the capacity of the plant's alkaloids to reduce a living human being to a state so profoundly altered, so stripped of agency and self-direction, that those who witnessed it, in the context of their cultural understanding, described it accurately in its phenomenological essence, if not in its pharmacological mechanism, as a form of death and resurrection. The tradition of zombification in Haiti, as it was studied by the Harvard-trained ethnobotanist Wade Davis, beginning in 1982, when Davis traveled to Haiti at the behest of Harvard botanist Richard Evans Schultes, is not a tradition that belongs to the realm of the supernatural, in the way that the word zombie has come to mean in the horror cinema of the 20th century. It is a tradition that belongs to the realm of voodoo social jurisprudence, which is to say the system of communal law and enforcement, that Haitian society, in certain of its traditional forms, used to punish those who were considered to have violated the rules of the community in the most serious possible ways. The Bokor, the practitioner of Vodou, who specializes in the arts of harm, as distinct from the healers and priests, who served the Lubaway in more protective capacities, was understood in this tradition to possess the knowledge necessary to administer to the condemned person a preparation powerful enough to simulate death so convincingly that even the physicians of the period could not distinguish it from the real thing, and the victim would be declared dead, buried, and then retrieved from the grave in the hours after the funeral, before too much time had passed, and administered a second preparation that would restore a degree of consciousness while maintaining a state of profound and managed confusion, of deep suggestibility and loss of autonomous will, that reduced the person to a state of compliance that the community understood as the appropriate punishment for their transgression. Wade Davis, in his 1985 book The Serpent and the Rainbow, described the ingredients of the zombie powder used in the initial preparation as including, among other things, the tetrodotoxin-containing skin and organs of the pufferfish, which in sufficient doses can suppress vital signs to the point of apparent death, and Datura stramonium, the concombra zombie, whose alkaloids, Davis argued, were responsible for the amnesia and prolonged disorientation of the revived zombie, administered as a paste of sweet potatoes, cane syrup, and datura that was force-fed to the zombie on a regular basis to maintain the state of managed compliance. The scientific community received Davis's hypothesis with considerable skepticism, and subsequent analyses of the zombie powder samples he brought out of Haiti found little or no tetrodotoxin in some of them, leading to a vigorous scientific debate that was not fully resolved to anyone's satisfaction, though Davis himself maintained, throughout the controversy, that variability in traditional formulations and potential errors in the testing process accounted for the inconsistent results, and that the cultural and social dimensions of zombification, the community's belief in the process, the zombies' own belief in their transformed state, the complete social isolation from their former life, were essential components of the phenomenon that no purely pharmacological analysis could capture. What remained less contested in this debate was the role of datura specifically, because the plant's capacity to produce amnesia, deep confusion, loss of agency, and prolonged disorientation in those who consumed it was documented independently of Davis's work and well established in the pharmacological literature, and the particular cruelty of using it as a maintenance preparation, keeping a human being in a state of permanent, managed delirium, unable to remember who they had been, or to construct an autonomous sense of purpose, reflects with a terrible clarity the nature of the compound at the heart of this history, which is a compound that does not merely alter consciousness, but in sufficient doses and under sufficient circumstances can appear to erase it. The case of Clairvius Narcisse, the man Davis investigated as a documented instance of zombification, was verified by Haitian physicians and researchers in ways that gave the phenomenon at least a degree of institutional credibility. Narcisse had been admitted to the Albert Schweitzer Hospital in Deschapelles, Haiti, in 1962 and had been declared dead by 2 American-trained physicians before being buried, and, by his own account, subsequently retrieved, and he surfaced again in 1980, 18 years after his supposed death. Recognized by family members in the marketplace of his village, his story of what had happened to him during those years, providing Davis with the primary account around which his investigation was organized. Over the years since Davis's research, historians and anthropologists who have continued to study the zombie tradition in Haitian society have emphasized that zombification as a practice was never common, never casual, never the product of mere malice or caprice, but was reserved for those who were judged by the community secret society known as the Bizango to have committed acts so harmful to the community, theft, betrayal, the abuse of power, that the extreme punishment of the removal of their social identity was considered proportionate, and this social context, this understanding of the practice as a form of communal justice rather than supernatural spectacle, is essential to understanding how Datura came to occupy such a specific and culturally defined role in this particular tradition. The zombie's cucumber, growing quietly at the edges of the Haitian roads, its white trumpet flowers opening in the tropical evenings, carried within it a chemistry that human beings had, over centuries of careful and terrible observation, learned to use in ways that transformed the most fundamental aspect of human experience, which is the sense of being a self, a continuous, remembering, choosing self, and the history of this use, sorrowful and complex as it is, belongs to the larger history of what this plant has meant to the human beings who have lived in its presence. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic and roughly simultaneous with the period of Haitian history we have been considering, the Datura plant was acquiring a very different but equally documented criminal reputation in the Indian subcontinent, where its capacity to stupefy and render compliant those who consumed it had been known to practitioners of certain forms of deliberate poisoning for centuries before the British colonial administration of India began to compile systematic records of the phenomenon in the early 19th century. The British colonial records from the 1830s onward contain numerous accounts of what was described as Datura poisoning, a category of crime in which the plant's seeds, or powdered plant material, were introduced into the food or drink of a victim with the intention of reducing that victim to a state of stupefied helplessness that would allow the perpetrators to rob them, and sometimes to do worse. The annual reports of the Bengal Medical Service and the records of the Indian Medical Gazette from the mid-19th century include case after case of travellers, pilgrims, and ordinary householders who were affected in this way, and the British forensic toxicologist who worked in India during this period, attempting to build a system of medical jurisprudence capable of dealing with the particular forms of poisoning prevalent in the subcontinent, found themselves confronting a challenge that was partly pharmacological, partly cultural, and partly institutional. The Indian Datura poisoners of this period were in some cases solitary opportunists, and in others organized groups, and the British colonial records describe a range of operational methods that reflect a fairly sophisticated, practical knowledge of the plant's properties. The seeds were ground and mixed with sweet preparations because their bitterness could be masked by sugar. They were introduced into shared meals in the context of apparent hospitality. They were added to the bang, the cannabis-based preparation that was a legitimate part of certain festive traditions, in contexts where the recipient would not notice the addition. The connection between datura poisoning and the phenomenon the British called thuggee, the organized fraternity of highway robbers who strangled their victims after first rendering them helpless, was noted in the colonial literature of the period. Those historians of a later era have been careful to distinguish between the documented reality of organized highway robbery using datura as a stupefying agent and the more elaborate and, in some respects, romantically inflated colonial narrative of the thuggee as a religious cult dedicated to the goddess Kali, a narrative that served certain purposes of British colonial justification that were not unconnected to the political project of establishing British authority over indigenous systems of law and order. The 1883 report in the Journal of the American Medical Association that documented the use of datura by criminals in Mecca who enticed pilgrims to eat food prepared with the plant's leaves, roots, and seeds, robbing them as they fell into the resulting stupor, reflects the same understanding and the same criminal application across a very different cultural and geographical context, suggesting that the plant's plant criminal utility had been understood across a remarkably wide range of societies and was not the product of any single cultural tradition, but of the simple observation available to anyone who witnessed the compound's effects, that a person in the grip of datura's alkaloids was a person who could not protect themselves. The historian David Arnold, in his 2016 work Toxic Histories, Poison and Pollution in Modern India, traces the development of the British colonial response to the specific problem of datura poisoning in India, showing how the effort to create legal and forensic frameworks capable of prosecuting datura poisoners drove the development of forensic toxicology as a systematic discipline in the Indian context, one of those instances in which the effort to understand and prevent harm produced knowledge of lasting value, though at considerable cost to the individuals whose poisonings were the occasions of that knowledge production. It is worth noting, as we drift through these histories, that the colonial archives are not neutral documents. They reflect the perspectives and priorities of the authority that created them, and the narrative of the datura-wielding criminal as a characteristic type of Indian crime carries within it assumptions about Indian society that are not free of the ideological distortions of the colonial relationship. But the pharmacological reality they document, the reality of a plant that could be and was used to render people helpless against their will, is a reality that the surviving case records establish with sufficient consistency to be considered historically reliable. The pilgrims robbed at Mecca, the travellers drugged on the roads of Bengal, the householders who woke to find their homes ransacked, and their memories of the preceding hours entirely absent. All of them experienced the same chemistry, the same blockade of acetylcholine, the same dissolution of the ordinary self into a fog that lifted, hours or days later, to reveal a world from which something valuable had been taken that could not be retrieved. It is the year 1922, and in a Dallas jail, 2 convicted criminals are being prepared for an experiment that their administrator, a Texas obstetrician named Robert Ernest House, believes will change the practice of law enforcement and criminal justice in ways that will make the world more orderly, more honest, and more just, though the subsequent decades will complicate this belief considerably. Dr. House had made his observation some years earlier in the context of his obstetric practice, where he had used scopolamine, the alkaloid derived from the Solanaceae plants, the compound whose isolation Albert Ladenburg had accomplished in 1881. As part of the twilight sleep technique for managing labor pain, and he had noticed, with the particular attentiveness of a physician who is also a theorist, that women in the twilight sleep state answered questions with a candor and an apparent inability to construct deliberate falsehoods that seemed to him to suggest something important about the compound's relationship to the mechanisms of deception in the human mind. House developed his hypothesis carefully and presented it publicly, arguing that scopolamine temporarily suspended what he called the brain's power of deliberate reasoning, leaving the subject in a state in which the automatic responses of the mind, which he believed to be truthful responses, were no longer suppressed by the higher cognitive functions that normally allowed a person to choose their words, manage their self-presentation, and construct a version of events that served their interests rather than reflecting their actual knowledge. The two Dallas prisoners who volunteered for the 1922 experiment, volunteering presumably because they had nothing to lose and possibly something to gain from a demonstration of their innocence, were administered scopolamine and questioned under its influence, and House reported that the results confirmed his hypothesis, that the subjects had answered with what appeared to be involuntary candor, and that one of them had subsequently described the experience with the remarkable statement that, under the drug's influence, he had felt a desire to answer any question he heard, that his mind seemed to center on the true facts of the answer, and that he spoke voluntarily without any strength of will to manufacture an alternative version. The term truth serum, which entered the popular vocabulary in the early decades of the 20th century and has remained there ever since, despite considerable scientific skepticism about its accuracy, was first applied specifically to scopolamine, and the compound's career in this particular application represents one of the stranger air chapters in the history of the Solanaceae alkaloids, a chapter in which the same chemistry that had produced the ecstatic visions of the Chumash ceremony and the criminal stupor of the Bengal pilgrim, robber was being proposed as an instrument of judicial truth extraction, an application that assumed that the compound could selectively remove the capacity for deception, while leaving the capacity for accurate memory and articulate speech intact, an assumption that subsequent research would find to be imprecise at best. During World War II, both the Allied and Axis powers investigated scopolamine as a potential interrogation aid, and the compound that had been derived from the plants of the nightshade family found itself in this period at the intersection of pharmacology and the most urgently lethal forms of political conflict that the 20th century produced, used by intelligence services, working in circumstances of extreme pressure and moral ambiguity, trying to extract information from captured enemies in ways that fell outside the ordinary boundaries of accepted conduct. The intelligence agency reports from this period, many of them declassified in subsequent decades, document the use of scopolamine in interrogation contexts in terms that are clinically restrained, but that convey to a reader bringing a pharmacological understanding to them the nature of what was happening to the subjects of these experiments. The disorientation, the suggestibility, the amnesia, the way the compound made the boundary between what was actually remembered and what was being confabulated under the pressure of questioning genuinely impossible for the subject to distinguish. The CIA's programs of the 1950s, which investigated a wide range of psychoactive compounds for potential interrogation use under the umbrella of what became known as Project McUltra, included scopolamine among the substances considered. And while the program ultimately focused more heavily on other compounds, the continued interest in the Solanaceae alkaloids reflects the persistence of the original intuition that a compound capable of dissolving the ordinary boundaries of selfhood might be capable of dissolving the boundary between what a person intended to reveal and what they actually knew. The scientific consensus that emerged from all of this investigation was not flattering to the hypothesis. Subjects under scopolamine were not reliably truthful, so much as reliably confused, and the confabulations they produced under questioning, the false memories and misattributed associations that the disoriented mind generated in its attempts to respond to stimuli, it could no longer properly process, were as likely to mislead an interrogator as to illuminate the truth, a conclusion that the more careful researchers in this field had suspected from the beginning, and that decades of practical application consistently confirmed. And yet the legend of the truth serum, the belief in the compound's capacity to strip away the self's defenses and reveal what lies beneath, persisted in the cultural imagination long after the scientific evidence had complicated it considerably, persisted in the thriller novels and the spy films and the conspiracy theories, persisting perhaps because it touches on something that people find genuinely compelling, which is the idea that there exists somewhere in the chemistry of the mind a layer of unguarded truth that can be accessed if only the right key can be found, and that the plants of the nightshade family, in their ancient and indifferent chemistry, hold something close to that key. During this same period of the 20th century, as scopolamine was being debated in the courtrooms and intelligence briefings of the industrialized world, the datura plant was continuing its quieter, older history in the landscapes and communities where it had always grown, and it was during the middle decades of the 20th century that a series of accidental poisoning events, some localized, some involving larger numbers of people, all of them documenting the same ancient chemistry in the modern context, began to build a body of toxicological literature that would eventually allow physicians and public health workers to understand and respond to datura poisoning with considerably more precision than had been possible in any previous era. The medical literature of the 19th and early 20th centuries had already accumulated a substantial record of datura poisoning cases, drawn from the notebooks of physicians in England, Germany, France, India, the United States, and other countries where the plant grew or had been naturalized, and this record provided the foundation for the more systematic toxicological understanding that the mid-20th century began to develop. The clinical picture of datura poisoning, as it was defined through these accumulated case reports, was consistent enough across all its instances to constitute a recognizable syndrome. And physicians who were familiar with the literature could, upon encountering a patient presenting with the characteristic combination of dilated pupils, rapid heart rate, flushed and dry skin, elevated body temperature, confusion, and hallucinations, arrive at the correct diagnostic conclusion with reasonable confidence, though the amnesia that typically accompanied the state meant that the patient could rarely provide a useful history of what they had consumed. The mnemonic that physicians developed for teaching the syndrome, hot as a hare, blind as a bat, dry as a bone, red as a beet, mad as a hatter, encoded in an almost nursery rhyme, form the essential physiological features that the alkaloids produced. And this phrase traveled from the lecture halls of 19th century medical schools into the clinical textbooks of the 20th century, and remains in use today as one of those pieces of medical teaching lore that bridges the historical and the contemporary, carrying within its rhythmic simplicity the accumulated observations of generations of physicians who had sat at the bedsides of patients affected by the plants of the nightshade family and tried to find words adequate to what they were seeing. The specific challenge of treating datura poisoning, as distinct from diagnosing it, was complicated by the absence, through most of this period, of a specific antidote, which meant that the physician's options were primarily supportive, consisting of maintaining the patient's vital signs and waiting for the alkaloids to be metabolized and cleared by the body's own processes, a wait that could last from several hours to several days, depending on the severity of the exposure, during which the patient remained in their disoriented state, sometimes frightened, sometimes tranquil, sometimes physically agitated in ways that required careful management, always unable to give a reliable account of what they were experiencing. Physostigmine, a compound derived from the calabar bean, was identified in the 19th century as having pharmacological effects that were in certain respects opposite to those of atropine. Where atropine blocked the action of acetylcholine, physostigmine enhanced it. And this complementary relationship eventually led to the development of physostigmine as a specific antidote for anticholinergic toxidrome, an antidote that was being used in emergency medicine by the 1970s. And that represented the first time in the long history of datura poisoning that a physician had at their disposal a specific pharmacological tool for reversing the compound's effects, rather than simply waiting for them to pass. The development of this antidote and the broader development of clinical toxicology as a specialized field of medicine over the course of the 20th century represents one of those places in the history of this plant where the accumulated human knowledge about its effects, gained over millennia of observation and at considerable human cost, was finally translated into a capability that could be reliably applied in the emergency department in the treatment of a patient whose pupils are so widely dilated that their eyes appear to contain only darkness, whose mouth is so dry that they cannot speak clearly, whose mind is wandering in a landscape that has nothing to do with the hospital room around them. It is worth pausing here in the soft darkness of this late hour to note that the emergency medicine physician of the 20th and 21st centuries, reaching for the physostigmine and the monitoring equipment, is working at the end of a very long chain of human observation and understanding, a chain that stretches back through the case reports and clinical notebooks and herbalists' manuals and ceremonial preparations of every culture that has encountered this plant, and that the knowledge in the physician's hands is not merely scientific in its origin, but is the product of all of that accumulated human experience with a chemistry that has been shaping human minds and human histories for longer than the written record can fully document. It is the year 2019, and in the Karamoja region of northeastern Uganda, in the districts of Napak and Amadat, something is happening that will eventually be recognized as the largest documented outbreak of food contamination by tropane alkaloids in recorded history, an event that connects the ancient chemistry of Datura stramonium to the modern systems of global food, aid, and supply chain management in a way that neither the ancient Chumash healers who prepared Momoy by firelight, nor the Victorian toxicologists who compiled their poison case reports could have anticipated. On the 13th of March, 2019, more than 200 people began presenting to health centers throughout the region with symptoms that included confusion, dizziness, convulsions, hallucinations, nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, arriving in the hours between 2 and 12 after the distribution of a batch of food aid. A fortified corn-soy blend known as super cereal or CSB+, which had been distributed by the World Food Programme as nutritional support for the food insecure communities of the Karamoja region, one of the most chronically underserved areas of Uganda. Public health investigators who responded to the outbreak traced it rapidly to a single batch of the fortified food, identified in the records as Batch X, which had been distributed on the 11th through 15th of March. And when samples of this batch were subjected to laboratory analysis, the results revealed the presence of 14 distinct tropane alkaloids, with atropine present at concentrations of between 25 and 50 parts per million, and scopolamine at between 1 and 10 parts per million. Both of these figures representing concentrations hundreds of times higher than the maximum allowable limits established by the European Food Safety Authority for tropane alkaloid contamination of food products. The source of the contamination was identified through the detection of proteins from Solanaceae seeds and the isolation of DNA, specifically matching Datura stramonium in the affected batch, pointing to contamination at the harvesting and production stages, where the seeds of Datura plants growing among the cereal crops had been inadvertently harvested alongside the soy and corn, and had passed through the processing stages without detection, a failure of quality control that the subsequent investigation traced through a supply chain originating in Turkey, passing through the port of Mombasa in Kenya, and ending in the distribution centers of the Karamoja region. By the time the outbreak had run its course, investigators had identified 293 suspected cases, of whom 5 had died, 4 in Napak district and 1 in Amadat district, with 2 of the deaths being children aged 2 and 10 years, whose particular vulnerability is attributed in the investigation report to the combination of the high alkaloid concentration in the contaminated food and the elevated prevalence of malnutrition among children in the Karamoja region, which may have reduced their capacity to metabolize and clear the compounds from their systems. For the majority of those affected, symptoms resolved within 24 hours of treatment with intravenous fluids, activated charcoal to limit further absorption, and sedatives to manage the neurological agitation that the alkaloids produced, and the outbreak subsided following the withdrawal of the implicated batch, though the investigation records note that some community members did not return the contaminated food despite the withdrawal effort, and that 2 smaller outbreaks occurred in late March and mid-April, as people who had retained their supply began to consume it. The public health response to the Uganda outbreak involved multiple international agencies: the World Food Programme, the United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the Uganda Ministry of Health, and the subsequent analysis of the outbreak in the scientific literature led to a detailed examination of the regulatory frameworks governing tropane alkaloid contamination of food aid products, and examination that identified significant gaps in quality control procedures along global food supply chains, and led to recommendations for improved testing protocols that were incorporated into the updated guidelines of international food safety authorities. What makes the Uganda outbreak particularly significant in the longer history of this plant is not merely its scale, though its scale, nearly 300 people affected, 5 deaths, in a period of weeks, is itself remarkable, but the way it reveals how the ancient chemistry of a roadside weed can travel invisibly through the most modern and technically sophisticated systems of global food distribution, arriving without announcement in the bowls of some of the most vulnerable people in the world, carrying within it the same alkaloids that the Greek physician Dioscorides described in the 1st century of the Common Era, the same compounds that the Chumash healers measured out with such care in their ceremonial preparations, the same chemistry that the Belgian soldiers at Jamestown consumed in their accidental salad in 1676, unchanged in their nature across all the centuries and all the cultural contexts through which this history has moved. Over the next several years following the Uganda outbreak, further studies of tropane alkaloid contamination in cereal crops established that datura stramonium contamination of grain was not a rare or localized phenomenon, but a relatively widespread risk in agricultural systems where the plant grew among or adjacent to cereal crops, and that the existing quality control measures in place in many countries were insufficient to reliably detect contamination at levels capable of causing harm, a finding that placed the plant's ancient chemistry squarely within the domain of contemporary food safety science and regulatory policy, adding yet another chapter to the long history of human beings being required to account for what this particular plant carried within it. The criminal history of scopolamine in the 20th century did not end with the intelligence services and the interrogation rooms of World War II. And by the 1970s, a different kind of criminal application had emerged in the nightclubs and bars of New York City, documented in the clinical records of Bellevue Hospital, and eventually investigated by the emergency physician Louis Goldfrank, who would later become one of the most prominent toxicologists in the United States, and whose investigation of this particular epidemic would contribute to the systematic understanding of anticholinergic toxidrome that shaped emergency medical practice for decades afterward. The pattern of crimes that Goldfrank encountered in the early 1970s followed a consistent structure. Men, typically travelers or businessmen visiting New York, would be approached in bars by individuals who were, in the manner of the era, described in the clinical reports as attractive and sociable, who would engage them in conversation, and in the course of that conversation, introduce a substance into their drink, a substance whose effects would manifest in the hours that followed as increasing confusion, docility, memory impairment, and a profound inability to resist or respond coherently to whatever was happening around them, leading typically to the victim waking many hours later in a park or hotel room, stripped of their valuables and entirely unable to reconstruct the events of the preceding evening. Goldfrank's investigation, which proceeded through careful clinical observation and eventually through the chemical analysis of a glass recovered from one of the crime scenes, a thin layer chromatography analysis that identified the scopolamine residue in the small amount of liquid remaining in the glass, established that the substance being used was scopolamine, almost certainly extracted from the eye drops used by ophthalmologists to dilate the pupils for examination, which were legally available and contained atropine and scopolamine in concentrations sufficient for the criminal purpose. The New York epidemic of the 1970s has a counterpart in the more recent and considerably more extensively documented phenomenon known in Colombia as burundanga, where the compound is extracted from the seeds of the borrachero tree, which is a species of Brugmansia, a close relative of Datura, also belonging to the Solanaceae family, and also containing tropane alkaloids, and is reportedly used in Colombia at a scale that investigators estimate, with the necessary uncertainty that attaches to any count of unreported crimes, at tens of thousands of incidents per year, involving robbery, sexual assault, and other crimes facilitated by the compound's capacity to render victims deeply compliant and amnesiac. The compound has acquired the name Devil's Breath in the Colombian context, a name that rhymes across the distance of centuries and cultures with the hierba del diablo, the herb of the devil, that the Spanish-speaking peoples of the borderlands had given to the datura plant centuries. Earlier, both names reflecting the same intuition about the chemistry they reference. But here is something that seems to act from outside the ordinary boundaries of human causation, something that operates on the self in ways that the self cannot prevent or resist, something that belongs in the imagination, if not in the pharmacology, to the category of the supernatural. The clinical researchers and public health workers who have studied these criminal uses of scopolamine in the late 20th and early 21st centuries have been careful to distinguish between the documented reality of the compound's criminal utility and what they call the urban myths that have attached themselves to the phenomenon. The widely circulated but apparently unfounded claim that a card or paper treated with scopolamine can produce zombification through skin contact, or that blowing a powder into someone's face achieves the same effect instantly. Myths that the pharmacological literature does not support, but that have nonetheless spread through social media and popular journalism with a persistence that reflects the enduring power of the plant's reputation for doing things to human beings that seem to exceed the ordinary mechanics of cause and effect. It is deeply sorrowful, as one reflects on these histories of criminal application, to consider the contrast between the careful, supervised, ceremonially embedded uses of the same or closely related compounds in the indigenous traditions we visited earlier in this account. The Chumash ceremony, the Zuni rain ritual, the Vodou tradition with its terrible severity, and the deliberate exploitation of a vulnerable person's chemistry for purposes of predatory crime. And yet, the contrast illuminates something important about what these compounds actually are, which is neither sacred nor profane in themselves, neither healing nor harmful in their own nature, but simply a chemistry that responds to whoever holds it and whatever intention guides their hand. During this period, the compound's notoriety brought renewed attention to the datura plant itself in the context of adolescent experimentation, and emergency departments throughout the United States and Europe began to see an increasing number of young people who had prepared and consumed tea made from datura leaves or seeds, drawn by an internet culture of substance experimentation that had discovered the plant's psychoactive potential while dramatically underestimating its toxicity and arriving in emergency rooms in states of acute anticholinergic toxidrome. Feverish, dehydrated, their pupils so wide that their eyes appeared dark, their minds wandering through landscapes of vivid and completely convincing hallucination that they experienced as entirely real, requiring the careful, patient management that the accumulated medical knowledge of the 20th century had made possible. Each of these young people arrived at the emergency room in this condition was in a very real sense the latest in a chain of human beings, stretching back to Dioscorides, to Theophrastus, to the unnamed Chumash boy of some ancient evening thousands of years ago, who drank his momoi preparation and encountered, in the quiet country of his altered mind, whatever it was that the plant was pointing toward, which the cultures of every era have described with different words, but which seems always to refer to the same fundamental experience of the edges of ordinary selfhood being dissolved, and something else, unnameable and vast, beginning to show through. It is worth considering, in the quiet of this late evening, what it is that draws human beings so persistently across so many centuries and so many cultures toward the plants of the nightshade family, and toward the experiences of dissolution and encounter that their chemistry offers, drawing them despite the well-known danger, despite the unpredictable dosage, despite the amnesia that means the experience leaves behind it not a memory to be revisited, but only a gap in the ordinary continuity of life, a parenthesis in consciousness that the surrounding culture must supply the meaning for, since the person who underwent it cannot. The historian of pharmacology Jonathan Ott, writing in the 1990s about the ethnobotany of psychoactive plants, suggested that what he called the desire for inebriation, for the deliberate alteration of ordinary consciousness, was among the most universal and persistent of human drives, appearing in every known human culture in one form or another, expressed through an enormous variety of plant preparations and practices and cultural frameworks, and resistant to all attempts at suppression by whatever authority happened to be in power at a given moment. The particular quality of the Datura experience, among all the many experiences available to human beings in search of altered states, is its quality of absolute conviction. The visions it produces are not experienced as visions, but as reality. The beings encountered in it are not experienced as hallucinations, but as genuine presences. And this quality of conviction has made it, in virtually every culture that has known the plant, a vehicle specifically for contact with the sacred, with the supernatural, with the figures and forces that the culture in question understands to inhabit the space just beyond ordinary perception. The Chumash boy encountered his spirit guide with complete conviction, and the medieval woman in her trance believed entirely in her attendants. The Sabbat and the Haitian zombie experienced the reality of his transformation with the same phenomenological certainty that the rest of us experience the ordinary facts of our lives. And in each of these cases, the question of whether the experience was real is a question that the pharmacology of scopolamine and atropine can only partly answer, because the experience itself, the encounter with something that seemed to lie beyond the ordinary, was real in the only sense that experience is ever real, which is that it happened in the consciousness of a human being and changed them, leaving its mark on what they understood the world to be and what they understood themselves to be within it. The philosophical literature that has engaged seriously with the experiences produced by psychoactive plants, from the phenomenological tradition of Merleau-Ponty to the more recent work of philosophers of mind who have taken an interest in the evidence these experiences provide about the nature of perception and consciousness, has generally converged on the view that the altered states produced by compounds like susopolamine and atropine, rather than simply distorting an otherwise accurate perception of reality, reveals something important about the degree to which ordinary perception is itself a constructed process, a kind of ongoing work that the brain performs continuously, selecting and organizing and interpreting the signals it receives from the senses into the stable, coherent, seemingly transparent experience of a world that simply is as it appears. When the alkaloids of datura interfere with the cholinergic systems that participate in this construction, what emerges is not nonsense, but a different construction, built from the same materials. The memories, the fears, the desires, the symbolic repertoire of the culture the person inhabits, but organized according to different principles, freed from certain constraints of plausibility and logical continuity, able to produce encounters with figures and landscapes that the ordinary, waking mind would immediately categorize as impossible. And in this way, the plant can be seen, as the many traditions that have used it ceremonially have seen it, as a tool for accessing a different mode of processing the world, a mode in which what is meaningful is not filtered through what is probable. The name the plant carries in the Spanish borderland tradition, Hierba del Diablo, the herb of the devil, and the name it bears in the title of this account, the plant that makes you see the devil. Both point to this quality, the quality of the encounter, with a presence that feels, to the person experiencing it, like it is coming from somewhere outside the ordinary self, from something other, vast, and not entirely benign, which is precisely the description that the mythologies of every culture give to those forces that operate at the edges of the human world. The forces that the human world has always known were there, and has always found some way through ceremony or pharmacology or the elaborate social architectures of religious practice to manage its relationship with. Over the centuries of this history, datura has been the vehicle through which the Chumash shaman entered the world of the spirits, through which the European witch believed herself transported to her sabbat, through which the Haitian zombie lost and was prevented from recovering the self that had been taken from them, through which the colonial pilgrims of Bengal were stripped of their possessions in the stunned quiet of the roadside, through which the Dallas prisoner felt his defenses dissolve, and his tongue move toward an honesty he had not intended. And in each of these encounters, as different as they are in every other respect, the chemistry was the same. The ancient, patient, indifferent chemistry of a plant that grows in disturbed soil along the margins of the world that human beings have made, waiting for whatever use the next human hand will put it to, opening its white flowers to the dark of every evening with the same serene indifference to what those flowers mean to any particular century or any particular culture, the same indifference with which all the natural world meets the stories that human beings tell about it, which are the stories of human beings always. In the end, even when they are told as the stories of plants, there is a particular kind of knowledge that moves through time, not in books but in bodies, passed from the hands of one generation to the hands of the next through the physical act of preparation and administration, through the careful watching of those who have consumed a substance, and the patient learning of what happens when the quantity is right, and what happens when it is wrong. And this is the kind of knowledge that governed the relationship between human beings and the datura plant through most of the long history we have been tracing tonight, through the centuries before the chemistry was understood, before the alkaloids had names, before the word anticholinergic existed in any language spoken anywhere on earth. It is this kind of knowledge, embodied, transmitted, embedded in ceremony and social structure, that the pharmacologists and ethnobotanists of the 20th century began to take seriously as a legitimate form of scientific information, recognizing that the accumulated practical wisdom of cultures that had worked with potent plant compounds for generations contained data about dosage, preparation, context, and effect that could not be dismissed simply because it had not been gathered through the methods of controlled experimental science. The ethnobotanist Richard Evans Schultes of Harvard University, who spent much of the middle decades of the 20th century traveling through the Amazon basin and other regions of the Americas, documenting the plant knowledge of indigenous peoples, wrote extensively about what he called the extraordinary sophistication of indigenous pharmacognosy, the indigenous science of plant-derived medicines, and his work helped to establish within academic botany and pharmacology a framework for taking seriously the knowledge that traditional cultures had accumulated about the plants they used. Schultes had an especially profound interest in the hallucinogenic plants of the Americas, and his monumental work with Albert Hofmann, the Swiss chemist who had first synthesized LSD in 1943, resulted in the 1979 publication of Plants of the Gods. Their sacred, healing and hallucinogenic powers, a volume that placed the Datura species within the broader context of the psychoactive plant traditions of the Americas and gave to a wide readership, for the first time in a popular format, a systematic account of what these plants were, what they did, and how human cultures had worked with them across the centuries. Schultes was also the mentor who sent Wade Davis to Haiti in 1982, and his influence on Davis's investigation of the zombie phenomenon reflects the way in which the serious academic study of indigenous plant knowledge in the 20th century created a network of researchers whose individual investigations, taken together, constitute a kind of distributed intellectual project aimed at understanding the full range of human relationships with the plant kingdom, including its most dangerous and most morally complex dimensions. The Datura species that Schultes documented in the Americas included not only Datura stramonium, but also the closely related species, Datura inoxia, known as sacred Datura or toloch, which was used in the ceremonial traditions of the Aztec and other Mesoamerican peoples, in ways that pre-colonial Spanish accounts described with a combination of horror and fascination. The Spanish missionaries and administrators who documented these practices, interpreting them through the framework of their own religious beliefs, and concluding that the visions produced by the plant were of diabolical rather than divine origin, a conclusion that inserted the plant's effects into the theological vocabulary of colonial encounter, and gave it, in the Spanish cultural imagination, the specific character of the diabolical that its common names in Spanish still preserve. The Aztec name for the plant was Tolotzin, and the Nahuatl medical literature of the pre-Columbian and early colonial period, preserved in documents such as the Badianos manuscript of 1552, the first medical text produced in the Americas, written by the indigenous Nahua physician Martinus de la Cruz, and translated into Latin by Juan Badiano, contains references to preparations involving toloch for the treatment of pain, and as a component of healing rituals, placing the plant within the formal medical knowledge system of the Aztec world. At a time when the Spanish conquest had only recently disrupted that world and its institutions were in the process of being replaced, suppressed, or absorbed by the colonial order. The Badianos manuscript, remarkable for being the earliest known herbal produced in the New World, represents a moment of extraordinary cultural transmission, a moment in which indigenous medical knowledge was being written down in a form that could survive the disruption of the oral and practical traditions through which it had previously been held, and its survival in the Vatican Library, where it resided for centuries before being returned to Mexico in 1990, is one of those quiet archival miracles that allow historians to glimpse, through a narrow window, the pharmacological knowledge of a civilization that was in many respects as sophisticated as anything the European world had produced, operating from a different conceptual framework, but arriving, through different methods, at understandings of the plant world that were in their practical dimensions largely accurate. Over the subsequent centuries of colonial Mexico, the use of toloch was incorporated into the hybrid religious and medical traditions that emerged from the encounter between indigenous and Spanish Catholic culture, and it appears in the folk medicine traditions of Mexico and the American Southwest, in contexts that reflect the layering of indigenous and European frameworks of understanding that characterizes so much of the cultural history of that region, the plant carrying with it, through all of these transformations, the same chemistry, the same alkaloids, the same capacity to dissolve the boundaries of the ordinary self. While the names and ceremonies and explanations built around that chemistry shifted and changed with the changing world, it is one of the enduring qualities of the datura plant and of the alkaloids it produces that they have survived every cultural framework that human beings have built around them. Every attempt to explain, to sacralize, to demonize, to medicalize, to criminalize, and to regulate them, surviving in the simple fact of their chemistry, which does not change, with the meaning that any particular culture assigns to it, and which continues to do what it has always done to the human nervous system, with the same patient indifference that the plant itself brings to the business of growing in disturbed soil and opening its flowers to the dark. The 19th century's gift to the history of datura was the isolation of its alkaloids, and the 20th century's gift was the understanding of precisely how those alkaloids produce their effects at the level of the individual nerve cells and the neural circuits those cells compose, an understanding that unfolded gradually through the development of neuroscience as a discipline, and that required the construction of an entirely new conceptual vocabulary for describing what happens inside the nervous system when signals are transmitted, interrupted, or altered by chemical compounds. The concept of the neurotransmitter, the chemical messenger that carries a signal from one nerve cell to another across the tiny gap between them, the synapse, was established through the experimental work of Otto Loewi, the Austrian pharmacologist, who in 1921 performed the celebrated experiment in which he isolated 2 frog hearts and demonstrated that a substance released by the vagus nerve of one heart, when transferred in solution to the other heart, reproduced the slowing effect of vagal stimulation, proving for the first time that nerve signals were transmitted by chemical means rather than by electrical current alone, and earning Loewi the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1936. The substance Loewi had identified was acetylcholine, the same compound whose blockade by atropine and scopolamine produces the syndrome that has been observed and recorded and feared across the centuries of datura's history, and the elucidation of acetylcholine's role as a neurotransmitter placed the pharmacology of the Solanaceae alkaloids for the first time within a mechanistic framework that could account for the full range of their physiological effects. Henry Hallett Dale, the British pharmacologist, who shared the 1936 Nobel Prize with Loewi, and who had been working on the pharmacology of acetylcholine and related compounds since the early years of the century, established the classification of cholinergic receptors, the cellular structures on the surface of nerve cells and other tissues that acetylcholine binds to in order to transmit its signal, into muscarinic and nicotinic types, named for the plant-derived compounds that selectively activated them. And this classification provided the framework within which the specific action of atropine and scopolamine as competitive antagonists of the muscarinic acetylcholine receptor could be understood, measured, and studied with a precision that earlier centuries had entirely lacked. The muscarinic receptors, as Dale's classification established them, and as subsequent decades of research refined and elaborated, are distributed throughout the body in the smooth muscles of the gastrointestinal and urinary tracts, in the glands that produce saliva and sweat and digestive secretions, in the heart where the vagus nerve modulates rhythm, and in the brain where they participate in a wide range of functions, including attention, memory formation, and the regulation of the sleep-wake cycle. And the breadth of this distribution explains why atropine and scopolamine, in blocking these receptors, produce effects that ripple through so many different organ systems simultaneously. The specific involvement of muscarinic receptors in memory formation, their role in the hippocampus and other brain regions involved in converting short-term experiences into long-term memories, is the mechanism underlying the amnesia that datura produces, the blank space in consciousness that follows a significant exposure, and the understanding of this mechanism, which developed through the neuroscience research of the 1970s and 1980s, connected the ancient observations of the plant's amnesiac properties to a specific molecular story that could be told with increasing precision as the tools of molecular biology became available to neuroscience. The same cholinergic systems of the brain are implicated in the neuroscience of dreaming, and researchers studying the pharmacology of rapid eye movement sleep have found that the cholinergic neurons of the brainstem play a central role in generating and maintaining the REM state, which suggests a pharmacological basis for the dreamlike quality of the datura experience. For the way the visions it produces have the phenomenological character of dreams, their absolute reality feeling, their narrative coherence, their quality of being experiences rather than merely sensations. A quality that the people who encountered these plants in every era and every culture recognized and tried to name with the conceptual tools their culture provided them, and which the neuroscience of the late 20th century began to be able to account for in mechanistic terms. The connection between datura's alkaloids and the neuroscience of sleep is not merely pharmacological, but also clinical, and scopolamine's sedative properties, its ability to produce a state of drowsiness and reduced alertness at doses lower than those required to produce full anticholinergic toxidrome, have been investigated in the context of research into sleep disorders and the pharmacological management of the conditions that make sleep difficult, connecting the ancient use of the plant by dioscorides as a pain-relieving and sleep-inducing agent to the modern clinical literature on sleep pharmacology in a thread that runs continuously through 2,000 years of medical history. It is a thread worth following for a moment. Here in this particular context, on this particular channel, on this particular late evening, the thread that connects the ancient understanding of datura as a sleep-inducing plant to the modern neuroscience of why certain compounds produce drowsiness, because it suggests that the human beings who first prepared and administered these plants, however they understood the mechanisms involved, were working with a real pharmacological relationship between the plant's chemistry and the brain's own machinery for regulating sleep, a relationship that the modern science has not refuted, but confirmed and articulated it in a language far more precise than any available to the ancient physicians, while leaving intact the essential accuracy of their original observation. Over the course of the 20th century, the study of the muscarinic receptor system and its relationship to the alkaloids of the Solanaceae plants contributed to the development of a new generation of pharmaceutical compounds designed to act on specific subtypes of the muscarinic receptor with greater selectivity and fewer side effects than the broad-spectrum antagonism of atropine or scopolamine. And these compounds, which include drugs used in the treatment of conditions as diverse as Alzheimer's disease, overactive bladder, and motion sickness, represent the pharmaceutical legacy of the long encounter between human beings and the chemistry of the thorn apple, translated through the work of generations of chemists and pharmacologists into medicines precise enough to offer therapeutic benefits while minimizing the disorientation and confusion that their ancestral compounds, harvested from the roadside plant, produced in such unpredictable and unmanageable abundance. The motion sickness patch that delivers a precise microgram quantity of scopolamine through the skin over a period of 3 days is perhaps the most ordinary descendant of the devil's herb, worn by travelers on cruise ships and by patients recovering from surgery, pressed against the hairless skin behind the ear, where the blood vessels run close to the surface, releasing its measured dose of the ancient alkaloid into the bloodstream with a steadiness that no preparation of boiled datura leaves could ever have achieved. And the fact that it is considered entirely unremarkable, a minor pharmaceutical convenience, available without prescription in many countries, reflects how completely the alkaloids of the Solanaceae plants have been domesticated by the pharmaceutical sciences over the course of the 20th century, separated from their original matrix of plant chemistry and ceremony and danger, and transformed into controlled, measured, calibrated agents of specific therapeutic purpose. Atropine is present in emergency medicine kits, in hospitals and ambulances throughout the world, used to treat certain forms of bradycardia, the condition in which the heart rate drops dangerously low by blocking the vagal inhibition that is slowing it, a use that was understood in principle by the physicians of the 19th century who had observed the compound's heart rate increasing effects and which has been refined and standardized through a century of clinical pharmacology into a precisely dosed intervention with established protocols for administration and monitoring. Atropine is also the antidote for certain forms of nerve agent poisoning. The organophosphate compounds developed as chemical weapons in the 20th century that work by preventing the breakdown of acetylcholine rather than blocking it, producing an excess of cholinergic stimulation rather than the deficit that datura causes, and which are treated with atropine in quantities that would be lethal if administered to a healthy person, doses measured in milligrams rather than micrograms, given in the urgent and terrible context of a chemical weapons attack to restore the balance of the cholinergic system that the nerve agent has overwhelmed. The fact that the same compound derived from the belladonna plant, that from the same alkaloid that was once associated with witches' ointments and diabolical visions, is now kept in emergency military and civilian medical kits as the specific antidote for the most devastating category of chemical weapon, is one of those historical symmetries that feel almost too deliberate to have emerged from the random accumulation of scientific discovery, though they have emerged from exactly that, from the patient and often unglamorous work of hundreds of researchers across multiple generations, each contributing a small increment to the understanding that eventually produces an application of lasting value. The development of drugs targeting muscarinic receptors for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease, represents perhaps the most poignant intersection between the history of Datura and the history of modern medicine. Because Alzheimer's disease, the progressive neurodegenerative condition, characterized above all by the destruction of memory, is itself a disease of the cholinergic system. The neurons that produce and use acetylcholine in the brain, particularly those of the basal forebrain nucleus, known as the nucleus basalis of Meinert, are among the first and most severely affected in Alzheimer's, and their loss is closely associated with the memory impairment that defines the disease's early stages, a loss of exactly the function that the scopolamine-induced amnesia of Datura poisoning mimics in its temporary and pharmacologically reversible form. Researchers studying the cholinergic system's role in memory in the 1970s and 1980s used scopolamine as what they called a pharmacological model of Alzheimer's disease, administering carefully controlled doses to healthy volunteers to produce a temporary state of memory impairment that could be studied and then reversed, using this model to test compounds that might restore cholinergic function and thereby improve memory. And it was through this line of research that the first class of drugs approved for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease, the acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, including donepezil, rivastigmine, and galantamine, were developed and tested, drugs that work by preventing the breakdown of acetylcholine in the synapse, thereby increasing its availability, which is, in a sense, the pharmacological opposite of what atropine does, a reversal of the Datura effect applied in the service of trying to preserve what the Datura plant temporarily dissolves. Galantamine, one of the most widely used of these compounds, is itself a natural alkaloid derived from the snowdrop flower and several related species. And its development as an Alzheimer's treatment represents a continuation of the long tradition of plant-derived medicine that runs from Dioscorides through the medieval herbalists, through the 19th century chemists who isolated the tropane alkaloids, a tradition in which the plant kingdom continues to provide, through the patient work of pharmacological investigation, compounds whose therapeutic applications could not have been predicted from the plant's appearance or its folk uses, but emerge only through the sustained application of scientific method to the question of what the plant contains and what that content does to the human body. The pharmaceutical history of the Solanaceae alkaloids is thus a history of translation. The slow, painstaking translation of ancient chemical observations embedded in ceremonial practice and herbalist knowledge and clinical case reports and toxicological records into the precise, measured, reproducible interventions of modern medicine. And this translation, which has been ongoing for nearly 2 centuries, since the first isolation of atropine by Mine in 1831, is not complete because the understanding of the cholinergic system and its role in consciousness, memory, and cognition continues to develop, and the therapeutic potential of compounds acting on muscarinic receptors continues to be explored by researchers whose work may yet produce treatments for conditions that remain poorly managed by the pharmaceutical tools currently available. In this sense, the plant that grows in disturbed soil along the margins of the world, that human beings have made, the plant that opens its white flowers to the evening and closes them before noon, the plant that carries in every part of itself a chemistry capable of dissolving the ordinary self, is not only a subject of historical interest, but an active participant in the ongoing project of understanding what the human brain is and how it can be helped when it fails. A participant that entered this project through the back door of toxicology and ceremony and crime and emerged through the front door of pharmaceutical chemistry as a contributor to some of the most consequential medical treatments of the modern era. The cultural life of datura in the 20th and 21st centuries has not been confined to the laboratory or the emergency room or the criminal record and the plant's long association with the edges of ordinary experience, with vision, with madness, with the sacred and the terrifying, has continued to generate a cultural production that reflects, in its own way, the same fascination that has driven human beings toward and away from this plant through all the centuries of the history we have been following. The Mexican muralist Diego Rivera, working in the 1920s and 1930s on the great public frescoes that were his principal contribution to the art of the 20th century, included representations of datura in several works, most notably in the murals depicting the pre-Columbian history of Mexico, where the plant appears as a marker of the ceremonial and medical traditions of the Aztec world, that Rivera, like many Mexican intellectuals of his generation, was consciously reclaiming as a source of national identity and cultural pride in the aftermath of the Mexican Revolution. The novelist Carlos Castaneda, whose series of books, beginning with the teachings of Don Juan, published in 1968, described his apprenticeship to a Yaqui shaman named Don Juan Matus, and included detailed accounts of the use of Datura inoxia, which he called the devil's weed, la hierba del diablo, as a vehicle for shamanic initiation and the acquisition of power, reached an enormous popular audience in the late 1960s and 1970s, and introduced the ceremonial use of datura to a generation of Western readers who were, in the context of the countercultural moment, actively interested in the expansion of consciousness and the questioning of ordinary assumptions about the nature of reality. Castaneda's work was controversial from the beginning with anthropologists and scholars of indigenous Mexican culture, raising serious questions about its accuracy and its relationship to actual Yaqui tradition, and the subsequent decades have seen his books progressively discredited as ethnographic documents, though they continued to be read and to exercise cultural influence, as works of a different kind, and their central figure of the devil's weed. Unpredictable, dangerous, not to be sought out lightly, demanding respect and causing harm to those who approached it with insufficient humility, captures something genuine about the plant's nature, even if the cultural framing through which that nature is presented is more literary than ethnographic. The association of datura with the counterculture of the 1960s and 1970s was not confined to Castaneda's literary representations, and the plant appeared in the writings and experiences of several figures associated with the psychedelic movement of that era, generally marked by the recognition that it occupied a different and considerably more dangerous category than the compounds. LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, that were the primary vehicles of psychedelic experimentation in that period, a recognition that the plant's capacity for genuine harm placed it in a category apart even within the context of deliberate consciousness expansion. The poet and artist Antonin Artaud, whose 1936 journey to the Sierra Tarahumara of Mexico in search of peyote ceremonies also brought him into contact with the datura traditions of the region, described in the remarkable documents of that journey a landscape of spiritual intensity that drew no clear line between the sacred and the terrifying, a quality that his biographers have associated with the altered states induced by the plant Materials he encountered, though Artaud's own accounts are so thoroughly filtered through his personal visionary sensibility that the pharmacological and the biographical are impossible to disentangle. The representation of datura in 20th century art and literature reflects, in its persistent association with madness, with diabolical encounter, with the dissolution of ordinary identity, the same cultural work that the plants' names have always done. The work of placing this chemistry within a human framework of meaning, of finding words and images adequate to the experience of having the ordinary world replaced by something else entirely, something that the plant conjures from the deepest materials of the mind and presents with the full force of reality. Georgia O'Keeffe, whose paintings of the datura flower constitute perhaps the most formally beautiful representations of the plant in the Western artistic tradition, painted the flower's white interior in a way that suggests depth without horizon, an opening into space that has no visible end, and this formal quality, the depth without horizon, the white space that opens and continues, seems to capture something in the plant's character that is not about darkness or danger, but about amplitude, about the suggestion of a space larger than the one that ordinary perception provides, which is, after all, what the plant chemistry does at the level of neurology, dissolving the ordinary construction of bounded selfhood into something less contained, less defined, more continuous, with whatever lies on the other side of the ordinary self's careful borders. The datura flower has appeared on the covers of literary magazines, in the background of photography concerned with the American Southwest, on the sleeves of certain albums in the psychedelic and ambient music traditions, in the botanical illustrations of scientific publications, and in the ceremonial art of indigenous communities, where the plant's cultural significance has survived the disruptions of colonialism and continues to be honored and maintained. And in all of these contexts, the flower itself, the white trumpet, opening in the evening, closing before noon, remains the same, indifferent to all the meanings that human culture has attached to it, continuing its ancient biological work of attracting the hawk moths that pollinate it in the warm summer evenings, remaining exactly what it is, regardless of what human beings have made of it, which is very nearly everything that human beings have ever made of anything that has frightened and beckoned them in equal measure from the margins of the world they thought they understood. The cultural life of a plant is never entirely separable from the pharmacological life of its compounds, because the reason the cultures return to it again and again, through their artists and their writers and their ceremonial practitioners and their fearful warnings, is precisely the chemistry. The fact that this plant does something to human consciousness, that consciousness then tries to account for, to frame, to contain within a narrative that makes it meaningful, and the variety of narratives that have been applied to this purpose across the centuries and the cultures reflects not the arbitrariness of cultural meaning, but the genuine difficulty of the encounter. The genuinely difficult thing that the plant presents to the human mind that must reckon with it. The legal history of the datura plant is, compared to the legal histories of many other psychoactive plants and substances, a relatively quiet one, marked by the absence of the kind of legislative drama that attended the criminalization of cannabis or the scheduling of LSD in the mid-20th century. And this relative legal quiet reflects a combination of factors that are worth considering as we move through the final portion of our account. Datura has not been scheduled as a controlled substance in most jurisdictions because the experience it produces is not, for the most part, sought out recreationally. The amnesia, the duration, the complete loss of control, the unpredictable and dangerous physiological effects, and the absence of any reliable, pleasurable component in the experience have placed it firmly outside the category of substances that people use for pleasure, and therefore outside the category of substances that legislators have felt the need to prohibit in order to prevent recreational use. The plant grows freely in most of the temperate world, is not commercially cultivated for its psychoactive alkaloids, except in the pharmaceutical industry where it is processed under controlled conditions. And its legal status in most countries is that of a wild plant that is not controlled in its natural form, though the extraction of its alkaloids for non-pharmaceutical purposes occupies a more ambiguous legal territory in jurisdictions where anticholinergic compounds are regulated as prescription-only medications. The pharmaceutical derivatives of the Solanaceae alkaloids, atropine, scopolamine, hyoscine, are regulated as prescription or controlled substances in most countries, available in the medical context in carefully calibrated preparations, but not available for general purchase, a regulatory status that reflects the long history of their criminal use and the genuine medical risks of unsupervised exposure. The regulatory frameworks that have developed around tropane alkaloid contamination of food crops are a more recent legal development, and the 2019 Uganda outbreak accelerated the development of binding international standards for maximum residue levels of tropane alkaloids in cereal-based food products, with the European Food Safety Authority updating its guidelines following the outbreak to establish stricter testing, requirements that have since been adopted in modified forms by several other regulatory jurisdictions. The criminal use of scopolamine in Colombia, where the compound extracted from the borrachero tree is used to facilitate robbery and sexual assault at the scale, described in reports from Colombian health authorities, has led to legislative and public health responses that have included awareness campaigns, changes to laws governing the chemical precursors used in extraction, and cooperation between Colombian and international authorities. Though the problem, rooted in a plant as common in the Colombian landscape as datura, is in the landscapes of other parts of the world, has proven resistant to the kind of regulatory suppression that works more easily for substances that require complex industrial synthesis. The legal status of the plant in indigenous contexts. The question of whether indigenous communities have the right to use plants that are part of their ceremonial traditions, even plants whose active compounds are regulated as controlled substances in the surrounding legal framework, is a question that has been addressed in various ways in different jurisdictions, most notably in the United States, where the Native American Church's legal right to use peyote in ceremony has been established through a series of legislative and judicial decisions that took decades to resolve, and which established a precedent for thinking about the relationship between indigenous ceremonial plant use and the drug laws of the dominant culture, a precedent that has implications for communities whose traditional practices involve datura or its relatives. The legal history of datura is thus a history of the plant occupying an interstitial position in the regulatory imagination, too dangerous to be entirely ignored, too ordinary, and too widespread to be effectively prohibited, too deeply embedded in legitimate medical use to be treated simply as a hazard, and too complex in its cultural dimensions to be adequately addressed by any single regulatory approach. What the legal history of this plant suggests, more broadly, is that the project of regulating the human relationship with potent plant chemistry is never simply a matter of prohibition or permission, but always involves negotiating between the multiple, competing, often irreconcilable claims that different communities and different interests make upon the same chemistry, claims that reflect the full complexity of what a single plant, growing in the disturbed soil of the margins, can mean to the full range of human purposes and human ways of being in the world. As we move through the final portion of this account, it is worth returning, as historical reflection often returns, to the beginning, to the plant itself, to the places where it grows, to the simple biological facts of what it is and how it came to be what it is. Because in the long journey we have taken through its history, through the centuries of ceremony and crime and medicine and art and science that have accumulated around this plant's chemistry, it is easy to lose sight of the fact that the plant is not a historical artifact but a living thing, persisting in the present, growing in the same disturbed soils and margins where it has always grown, producing the same flowers and the same seeds and the same alkaloids, continuing the same biological work that it has been performing since, long before the first human being bent over it and wondered what it might do. Datura stramonium, the most widely distributed of the Datura species, is now found on every continent except Antarctica, having spread from whatever its original range may have been. A question that botanists have not fully resolved, with some evidence pointing to a Central American origin, and other evidence suggesting South Asian origins, or even a polyregional evolution. Through the same combination of human assistance and its own opportunistic colonization of disturbed habitats that has made it one of the most cosmopolitan of the world's weedy plants. In the Bengaluru of the present day, as in the Istanbul and the Lagos and the Sao Paulo and the Kansas City of the present day, Datura plants grow in empty lots and along railway embankments and in the edges of construction sites and at the margins of agricultural land, their trumpet flowers opening in the evenings, their spiny seed pods ripening through the summer months, their chemistry unchanged from the chemistry that made them meaningful to every culture that has encountered them. The global distribution of the plant is a form of botanical history in itself. The movement of Datura seeds through the shipping routes and colonization patterns and agricultural exchanges of the last 5 centuries has left a traceable record in the genetic variation of populations across different continents, and the analysis of this genetic record by botanists using the molecular tools available to modern plant science has added another layer of understanding to the already complex history of a plant that has been, in the most literal sense, a traveling companion of human civilization through the centuries of its global expansion. The persistence of the plant in environments that have been heavily modified by human activity is a reflection of the same quality that has made it historically significant. Its ability to establish itself in the margins, in the disturbed ground that other plants have given up, in the places where the ordinary order of things has been disrupted, and something unexpected has moved in to fill the space. A quality that feels, when you consider the plant's history, almost like a form of character, a kind of botanical stubbornness that has allowed it to outlast every attempt to understand or control or contain it. The contemporary ecology of Datura is of interest to botanists, studying the dynamics of invasive plant species and the mechanisms by which plant alkaloids function as ecological defenses. And the research literature on these topics is substantial and ongoing, adding new dimensions to the understanding of compounds whose pharmacological properties have been studied for nearly 2 centuries, but whose ecological roles, the ways they function within the plant communities and animal communities where the plant exists, are still being worked out with the tools of modern ecology and evolutionary biology. The seeds of datura are dispersed by a variety of mechanisms: by wind, by water, by the coats of animals, and by the activities of human beings. And each seed carries within it, encoded in the biochemical machinery of the plant embryo, the capacity to produce the full suite of tropane alkaloids that have made this plant significant to human history, alkaloids that will begin to be synthesized as soon as the seed germinates and continues to be produced through the plant's entire life cycle, serving their original biological purpose of deterring the animals that might consume the plant, fulfilling the evolutionary imperative that produced them millions of years ago, indifferent to all the additional purposes that the human world has found for them in the centuries since the two trajectories, the plant's evolution and the human being's curiosity, first converged. The deep biological history of the tropane alkaloids, the evolutionary story of how the Solanaceae family came to produce these compounds, and how that production has been maintained and modified across the millions of years of the family's evolution, is a story that molecular phylogenetics, the analysis of genetic relationships through the comparison of DNA sequences, is beginning to tell with increasing resolution, tracing the origins of the biosynthetic pathways that produce the alkaloids back to the common ancestors of the Solanaceae family, and illuminating the ways in which natural selection has shaped the concentrations and proportions of different alkaloids in different species in response to different ecological pressures in different environments. A story that connects the chemistry in the white petals of a plant growing on a roadside outside Bengaluru on a summer evening to the deepest processes of biological evolution and the longest available perspective on the history of life on Earth. And so we arrive, at last, at the end of this long account, here in the soft quiet of this late hour, here, where the night has grown deep and still, and the only sound is perhaps the slow rhythm of your own breathing, which has grown longer and more even in the time since we began. The breath moving in and out with the unhurried regularity of something that no longer needs to be managed, something that is happening on its own, the way sleep happens on its own when the mind finally releases its hold on the waking world and allows itself to drift. We have traveled together in the hours of this account from the ancient rock art of the American Southwest to the medieval witch trials of Europe, from the laboratories of 19th century German chemists to the emergency rooms of 20th century New York, from the mountain highlands of Haiti to the food distribution centers of Uganda, from the Badianus manuscript of 1552 to the molecular pharmacology of the 21st century, following a single thread that connects all of these places and all of these people through the simple fact of a chemistry. The chemistry of 3 alkaloids, atropine and scopolamine and hyoscyamine, carried in the white flowers and spiny seed pods of a plant that grows in disturbed soil at the margins of the world that human beings have made. The plant that makes you see the devil has not always brought encounters with devils. It has brought spirit guides to the Chumash boy, sacred presence to the Aztec priest, useful medicine to the asthmatic patient, a model for the neuroscientist studying memory, a motion sickness remedy to the cruise ship passenger, an antidote for nerve agent poisoning to the military medic. And in each of these uses, the same alkaloids have been doing different work in service of different purposes, demonstrating with quiet consistency that chemistry is not meaning, that the molecular event at the muscarinic receptor does not carry within it any particular significance, but acquires significance from the human context in which it occurs, from the ceremony and the desperation and the curiosity and the greed and the healing intention that surround and direct its application. The history we have traced is not a history of evil, any more than it is a history of holiness. It is a history of human beings, encountering something powerful and trying in the ways available to them in their time and culture, to make use of it, to understand it, to manage their relationship with it, and to protect themselves and each other from the harms it could cause when it was encountered carelessly or with malicious intent. And in this, it is a history, very much like the history of fire or of metal or of any of the other capacities that the natural world has offered to human civilization, and that human civilization has shaped into the full complexity of its actual relationship with the natural world, which is never simply use and never simply reverence, but is always both of these things and more, always inflected by the particular needs and fears and knowledge and ignorance of the moment in which the encounter occurs. The datura plant, growing at the edge of the road on a warm summer evening, its white flowers opening in the fading light, knows nothing of any of this history. It is a plant. It has no knowledge. It carries its chemistry as it has always carried it, for purposes entirely its own, purposes that were old when the first human being bent to examine it, and that will continue to be fulfilled long after the last human account of the plant has been written and filed away in whatever archive the future holds for the records of the present. And that is, perhaps, a quietly comforting thought to carry into sleep. The thought of the natural world, persisting in its own purposes, the white flowers opening and closing on their own ancient schedule, indifferent to the weight of all the history that has been built around them, the seeds travelling on their own unhurried journeys through the changed and changing world, the chemistry continuing its molecular work in the deep interior of the plant, patient and purposeful and entirely unconcerned with the human drama that has unfolded around it, century after century, since the first human eyes turned toward it in something that was equal parts wonder and fear. Here you are now, safe and still, your body warm and heavy in the quiet of your room. The long account of this ancient plant, settling through your mind like pollen, drifting down through still air, each detail sinking gently below the threshold of waking attention into the deeper waters where the mind goes when it releases the day where the centuries compress and the distance between the Chumash ceremony and the modern emergency room. And this particular moment of your particular life collapses into the single undifferentiated present of almost sleep, where history is simply everything that has happened, and your breath is simply the sound of being alive in this moment, and no other. Let the devil's herb fade back into the margins where it grows. Let the centuries fold away. Let the white flowers close, as they always close, before the noon of this or any other day. And let whatever remains of your waking mind drift, slowly and without effort, into the long, dreamless, untroubled dark